they're really getting away with it, and it's all going to their profits, to the exclusion, some would say, of the Australian public.
If you've got someone covering the seat when someone's away on leave, if then they have to look at a payment or something that's happened, they're more likely to look at that and say, hey, that's not quite right, and have a better look into that. So often those sorts of fraudulent behaviours are discovered whilst an employee is on leave.
I feel like founders have a way of pulling a business to the surface and being like, this is the why. And my personal why of not feeling skin confident resonates with so many customers. I don't feel confident. My skin's not perfect. I want to feel confident. So if I can help as many women feel skin confident, that makes me different to anything else in the market.
You know, the pressure might be more on the government to say, well, is there something you can do? And if you can do it sooner rather than later.
But there's one thing we know about this year, it's that there is a lot of uncertainty and volatility out there. It's been a rocky start to the year for financial markets. And so the pace and timing of those additional cuts very much still uncertain.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top NBR stories from the past week. First up in this week's Underarm column, senior journalist Simon Shepherd and Australia correspondent Lachlan Cahoon discuss what happens when a source of national pride for many Australians falls short of domestic demand.
Australia is one of the biggest exporters of gas in the world, and yet the country is facing the somewhat absurd prospect of needing to import gas for domestic use. It's a bizarre and complex situation which is causing a lot of angst across the Tasman and is the subject for this week's Underarm column. So I'm joined by NBR's Sydney correspondent, Lachlan Calhoun. Lachlan, how big is the gas industry? I mean, surely there's enough for everyone.
Well, Simon, you think there would be. I mean, recently it's gone through a huge expansion, particularly in Queensland, where companies like Santos have built a huge network of pipelines, fracking sort of inland in Queensland, taking it to the coast and exporting it. Australia vies with Qatar as the world's biggest producer of LNG, and we export 80% of what we produce. So that's worth around 70 billion Australian dollars or so each year. And it mainly goes to Japan, China and South Korea. So they recently rounded up the industry. Queensland and Western Australia are the biggest producers. And it just seems an incredible situation that we would have to be thinking of importing it. But it looks like we might have to do it from next year.
Wow. Well, how has it happened? How could there possibly be a shortage?
When the industry expanded about 10 or 15 years ago, particularly in Queensland, the big producers locked themselves into long-term contracts with North Asian utilities. So they're committed to these exports. So a lot of it has to go offshore under these contracts. The industry said that, we've got plenty of gas. There's going to be enough for everybody. So the government didn't regulate to create a domestic reserve. There's one in WA, which is a statewide one, but there's no regulation for a national reserve for domestic gas. And the industry, in fact, had a huge free kick. The Australia Institute, which is a think tank here, they estimate the industry pays no royalties on about 56% of the gas Australia exports. So in WA, which is an LNG powerhouse, LNG royalties over 224 came to about $520 million. Western Australians spent $1.3 billion on registering their vehicles, their cars and motorbikes. So the industry is really getting away with, they're really getting away with it, and it's all going to their profits, to the exclusion, some would say, of the Australian public.
Right. Now, I understand Victoria somehow is at the centre of this issue. What happened there to create that?
Yeah, you can't exclusively blame the producers, because Victoria's been living off cheap gas from the Bass Strait since the 1970s. And in fact, at one point they were exporting gas to South Australia and New South Wales, but that's been running down. Those reserves are running down, and it's almost finished with the gas there. And yet 2 million houses in Victoria are on gas because they tooled up in the 70s for all the houses to have gas. There's a huge gas infrastructure there. And so the state government has a commitment to net zero, and as a result, they've banned fracking, and they've turned down requests for an import terminal in Geelong. So Victoria's in this ridiculous situation of having huge demand for gas and having a dwindling supply. So that's the real centre of the shortage, and that's where it's likely to be imported into.
Right. It sounds like a long-term problem, or is there a solution at hand?
The plan is to wean Victorians off gas, but that's going to, even if it takes 20 years, I think I saw a figure that 200 Victorian households per day would have to quit gas for there to be no gas needed in 20 years' time. So they're really between a rock and a hard place, and the state government is being pressured by environmentalists to continue the fracking ban and not allow an import facility. So there's an import facility being constructed in New South Wales, which can reach Victoria by the network of pipelines. So it may be that that they're going to have to rely on New South Wales for their gas going into the future. So, I mean, demand is falling. It's possible that it will come down to a point where we don't need to, but this problem has been foreshadowed for a long time. And at the moment, it looks like we may be in an extremely ironic situation of having to import gas from Qatar next year.
Prevention is key in this week's Toil and Trouble. B Employment Law Senior Associate Charlotte Joy and co-editor Hamish McNichol discuss the do's and don'ts when it comes to handling an increase in workplace fraud.
Welcome to 2025 and a new year of Toil and Trouble. Employment Court Judge Catherine Beck recently warned employers and employment lawyers about an increase in workplace fraud. Joining me now to discuss the issue is Charlotte Joy, Senior Associate with B Employment Law. Welcome, Charlotte. Why don't we start off with what exactly Beck said about employers and what they should do in this increase in workplace fraud?
So prevention is definitely key. It's often cheaper and quicker to actually have prevention strategies in place rather than run a subsequent investigation into potential fraud.
Right.
But I think at the starting point, an employer needs to be really aware of the scope of potential fraud. It's not just money being shifted around. It could be employees adding extra hours to timesheets. It could be creating sort of false employees on the books. There's a whole wide scope there.
And I guess, you know, it's all well and good to have a policy and to try this prevention thing, but how do you make sure that your staff are aware of these policies and things like that?
So training is really key, and also retraining on a continuous basis, making sure that employees actually understand the processes that they have to follow and those being straightforward rather than just a policy document which isn't really lived and breathed. It's also important to have more than one person aware of what the correct processes are. If you've just got one person running your accounts, then it's a little bit easier for that sort of person to do things in a mischievous way.
And I guess maybe as an employer you might think some of this stuff is obvious and so you don't need to necessarily train your staff around these sorts of things as well?
You would think that, but again, I think, prevention is so much cheaper and easier, so if you can avoid yourself the drama later, it's best to tick all the boxes.
So despite Beck issuing this warning, Ministry of Justice figures do show sort of fraud or theft by a person in a special relationship charges are going down or have been going down in the last couple of years. So does that sort of hint that maybe some of these things are being settled outside of court? Or
So I wouldn't say that they're being settled, because I think employers take a pretty firm stance when they think that money has been taken from them or something else has happened. But definitely that they are resolving it themselves, yes, and making that decision that perhaps once a process and perhaps a dismissal has occurred, that they're comfortable to leave it at that rather than take it to the next step.
Okay. We've got the Serious Fraud Office in New Zealand, obviously, which deals particularly with the major cases. I mean, this is something that smaller businesses need to be vigilant of as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's them being aware of that sort of scope of fraud in particular, looking at the little things, as I say. For a small business, if someone is adding extra hours to the timesheets or sending them, themselves a discretionary bonus, that can make a real impact.
Beck also said these things tend to get picked up when people are away. Why is that?
Yeah, so what she's saying there is if you've got someone covering the seat when someone's away on leave, if then they have to look at a payment or something that's happened, they're more likely to look at that and say, hey, that's not quite right, and have a better look into that. So often those sorts of fraudulent behaviours are discovered whilst an employee is on leave.
So the employee that hasn't been on leave for months and months might be suspicious.
That's right.
Well.
Yeah, they might be a bit nervous to go on leave because they're worried that someone might pick it up. Absolutely right.
She also had a Law Association conference late last year. A lot of this fraud tends to occur in law firms themselves as well? What do you think that is?
Yeah, I'd like to think that that's not as common as what she might think, but I think that in the legal sector there are a lot of small practices or sole practitioners. There is also a lot of money sort of moving around, particularly with trust accounts and things. So I guess there is a broader scope for potential fraudulent behaviour to occur. But yeah, I think that it is across the board as well in all sectors.
So if you're a firm, you do suspect someone that you employ is committing fraud or might be up to no good like this, how best to go about handling that sort of situation?
I think first you really need to sort of preserve the evidence or information that you're probably going to be looking at. You don't want suddenly email chains or something to be deleted and you can't access that. So preserving information and then having a really careful think about what type of investigation you want to run, engaging a specialist as needed, and just being really careful about how you involve the individual you're concerned about. I think if you run in there too soon with allegations of theft or fraud, that can really present a roadblock to your investigation, and you don't have that information yet. You can't make that sort of allegation without the facts.
How prepared do you think companies are generally with dealing with this sort of stuff as well?
I think that companies often react quite emotionally, which is completely understandable. But I think that initial emotional response, particularly if allegations are being thrown around without an investigation occurring, can really make things difficult down the line.
Talked about obviously the importance of prevention as a measure here. What about in terms of, obviously background checks and things like that on prospective employees? We've had a couple of really high profile cases like this where, say, Joanne Harrison, I think her name was, at the Ministry of Transport, she'd done this sort of thing before and yet was rehired and did it again. I mean, how important is that sort of due diligence on prospective employees as well?
Yeah, I can't overstate that. You'd be surprised how many employers don't go and get those references. They just rely on the written reference. So it is really important for the employers to do their checks. I mean, conviction checks can be done with the individual's consent, but they only go so far in terms of a conviction. It's not necessarily going to show a police inquiry that didn't go anywhere. But it's also important to look at your employment agreements and make sure that there is the ability to withdraw an offer of employment if you subsequently find something out.
Cool. Finally as well, I mean, downturn the last year or so, pretty tough times out there. Do you see more of this sort of stuff in those sorts of times?
Yeah, I think that's right. People are unfortunately a little bit desperate, and mental health is certainly a big issue for employers as well, and those two factors can certainly result in your employees who you think have the best intentions unfortunately making mistakes.
Ed and I co-founder and majority owner Edna Swart has built a profitable business that has expanded globally after originally making a name for herself through reality television. She sat down to talk business with Kate McVicker.
Why don't you tell me about why you started this business?
There's two reasons why I started the business. One is I had a massive insecurity personally about my skin growing up, severe acne. I went on multiple doses of Roaccutane, Isotane. It didn't work, and I really suffered with self-confidence growing up. And the other reason too, more of a personal, where you want to work for yourself. You want to build your own dream. You want to have your own purpose. There's like two purposes. It's not like the sense of the business purpose, and there's like a personal purpose why I wanted to start the business.
What were you doing before this?
I was in the corporate world. I was a banker. Working for one of the big four, and I did the corporate gig for about 8 years, climbing the ladder, and then realised it's not. I'm a very creative spirit, like I want to do stuff, I'm a doer, I want to create things, and corporate was just too much red tape for me.
And you started off in swimwear, is that correct?
Ed and I Body started as a passion of creating swimwear. I really wanted to start my own simplistic swimwear that I felt like it was missing in the New Zealand market. So it was more, I guess, like many small businesses start. It's a passion, it gives you something to do outside of corporate. And then as that grew, I wanted to bring in something that was a product that you could keep buying, so really grow the business. And that's when I leant into the insecurity that I had about body acne. So if you're wearing a bikini, I thought, why don't we bring up products to help you feel body confident with your skin? And that's where the body care range first was born.
But you've sort of closed the swimwear side of things now, haven't you?
Yeah, we closed the swimwear. I think we kind of officially closed it a couple of years ago, but then last year I thought, why not bring out like a limited edition run? Because the last time we did swimwear was in lockdown. So we launched a collection and 2 weeks later we went into lockdown. And I felt like our last moment with swimwear didn't have its moment. So we brought out the final collection and it did really well. It did really well, but it was time to say goodbye and really focus on what we are good at.
How many products do you actually have on the market at the moment?
So permanent SKUs, I believe we're sitting at, is it 14 or 15? 14. Working on the 15th one at the moment, yes. But 2 brand new SKUs coming out this year. 3, hopefully, if all goes well, and 1 limited edition to a current SKU. We're very much like last year and this year, we're very much in the SKU growth stage, where if we can diversify our products, that has an effect on the bottom line.
There's so many sort of skincare businesses at the moment, and even sort of things like dietary supplements and stuff like that. How do you stand out from the crowd?
I think the way that you really stand out is the founder story. Like many businesses, I feel like founders have a way of pulling a business to the surface and being like, this is the why. And my personal why of not feeling skin confident resonates with so many customers. I don't feel confident. My skin's not perfect. I want to feel confident. So if I can help as many women feel skin confident, that makes me different to anything else in the market.
What are you going to have to do differently in the US? I mean, the US is such a tough market, especially for retailers. It's sort of the big beast, right? How are you going to have to alter your business model? What are you having to adapt, I guess?
Well, firstly, New Zealand was very led by me. People knew me. There was a lot of my face, my story. It's very founder-led. There'll be an element of that in the US, but the approach to America is going to be different. It's not going to be me forefronting all the socials and so forth. So we're doing a different way of advertising. We're going to have to lean into, because it's very new, we only started at the start of this year. We're going to have to lean into local PR. We're going to have to lean into local faces over there and sort of test the market, what will, what won't work. It's a little bit of an unknown at the moment, but I'm excited because since we have launched, we've had traction already. So I know that the product is being picked up well over there. Now it's just about growing that and how do we do that.
When did you officially launch over there?
It was a soft launch in December.
I feel like there's always that concern, like with sort of influencers or celebrities and stuff, when they get into a business and they just put their name on it, you know?
Yeah, I think
so
there's a misconception that people think I'm a celebrity or an influencer. The brand didn't start off the back of me being known. The brand started and I did everything I could and took opportunities that came my way to be known for the purpose of the brand. And so people have noticed the brand or noticed me, and then the brand came after. But the business was there prior to me even having any public view.
And as you expand internationally, do you think you'll have to hire staff over there?
I would only assume we'd have to hire more staff as we expand, but I take that day by day as we come. We don't know the beast of America yet. We don't know what the team is capable of or what we are going to put in from our end. I can only hope for good. That's what I attract every day. But I've thought about what it would look like, hypothetically, if things did change. I would need to hire X. I'd like to have another full-timer that I could have with me every day, and sometimes it gets lonely as a founder sitting by yourself and just, you know, beavering away. So that would be nice, but we'll see how it goes.
We talked before about competition and I guess how you've played such a key role in the New Zealand market. Are you concerned going into the US that I guess they won't know who you are? You're another name, I guess, on Amazon.
I'm not concerned because I know our product is so good, and I can tell by the reviews that are coming through Amazon already that I'm leaning into the efficacy of the actual brand, not me. At the end of the day, I founded it and that's my passion. But if the products don't speak for themselves, then there's no future for the brand. And I think we're going to have to really lean into the actual brand itself and what it represents.
And are you interested in Australia as well? Why the leap to the US initially?
I did some consulting with people in Australia at the time when I think it was halfway through last year, we were making the decision as a team, do we lean into Australia or do we lean into America? Australia, from what I was told and what we were seeing in the market, it was extremely tough. There were a lot of brands being kicked out of retailers, as much as we were facing a recession, so was Australia. And it was just very tough. So they thought, don't launch into Australia just yet, give it a little bit more time. So I said, okay, that's cool, I will take your advice because I'm not an expert over there, so I'll take it. And that's when an opportunity came with a team out of America who had worked with other very successful New Zealand brands, the team that fronted them through Amazon, and said you need to speak to them and how they can help you grow in the States. So as one door closed, another door opened, and I'm glad it worked that way.
What would you say your broader focuses are for the next 6 or 12 months with the business?
Well, Ed and I is positioning ourselves we always run Ed and I in a position that if somebody came to acquire us, we're ready to be acquired. So we work very hard on our CAGR. It's one of the things that we're always strong on. And I don't know any founder that sits in a business for passion or like for a hobby. You know, you grow a business and hoping one day somebody sees it as a great opportunity to acquire you. So we're always open to that. If you're asking me in the next 5 years, I don't know if I'll be here, but I'm hoping somebody sees the potential that this business has and works alongside me or would like to take it bigger.
Media company NZME this week announced it would cut 38 jobs as part of a restructure of its news operation. It comes after a tough 2024, which saw TV3's News Hub disestablished, with the loss of hundreds of jobs, as well as cuts to programming at TVNZ. Political editor Brent Edwards has more analysis. Job losses announced at NZME this week simply reinforce the crisis facing the news media. We'll talk about that and whether the government can help. Let's bring in our political editor, Brent Edwards. So is there much the government can do here, Brent?
Well, there's a little it can do. I mean, it can't save the news media, if you like, but I mean, there are some steps it can take. And if you remember, last year, Melissa Lee lost her job as Media and Communications Minister because she was seen as not doing enough to help the news media. And since then, the new Minister, Paul Goldsmith, has done further work on this Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill, which was aimed at giving some leverage to news media organisations to negotiate with the digital platforms over getting payment for news stories that were put up on those platforms. But now, obviously, just in the late last year, Paul Goldsmith has put a halt to that while he waits and watches developments in Australia.
OK, what is happening over the ditch?
Well, in Australia, they've had similar legislation which worked for a year or two, but then the digital platform said, you know, bugger you, we're not going to do it anymore. And basically we're saying we're not paying, we're not putting up your stuff. So what the Australian government is doing in response to that is now proposing, and euphemistically it's been called a Google tax, and the idea's been around for years actually, but it's proposing to tax those digital platforms, the likes of Google, Facebook, etc., and then redistribute that money to news media organisations. And of course, I think the details are still being worked through because you then have to have some sort of criteria around what constituted a news media organisation and then on what basis would it get a share of that tax revenue. But that's the idea. So that would provide another set of revenue for the news media, which has seen a collapse in its advertising revenue because that's all gone to the digital platforms, and would help at least prop them up. It's not going to be the end, be all and end all and make life completely rosy, but that's seen as a way that you can get a bit more revenue into those news media companies to help them survive.
Well, how can the New Zealand government act then?
Well, I think what Paul Goldsmith's saying is, he's just watching those developments. So presumably the government here, if Australia proceeds with that plan and it seems to be working, that the New Zealand government here might follow suit. But of course, there are big issues around that. I mean, from a journalistic point of view, you can say, well, is that too much government involvement? What about the independence of the media? I think the arguments in Australia is if you set it up as a part of a tax and it's administered that way, then there won't be any political involvement. You'll have a criteria set in place. Tax will be collecting money. But there'll be, I would imagine, political parties, particularly like ACT, which might not be so keen on the idea of another tax. So it'll be interesting to see what the debate is. But certainly we all know at the moment, those of us particularly who work in journalism, that there's a lot of strife in the sector.
Yeah, because in the meantime, people are losing their jobs, aren't they?
Well, meantime, people are losing their jobs, in what's seen as the mainstream news media. And apart from, clearly actually NBR is doing well with its particular model, subscription model and journalism. But apart from that, actually most mainstream news media organisations are struggling with a fall in advertising revenue and the like. And the only probably news media organisation in the mainstream that might be seen as doing well is Radio New Zealand, but of course that is funded by the government, and the government has increased funding for that quite substantially. So I guess the question will be if it has an interest in maintaining a level of critical journalism, which people argue, and I would argue is critical to a democracy, there maybe ought to put in place some sort of mechanism which will allow more funding to get through to those commercial news media organisations as well.
Well, how long is the government prepared to wait to watch this Australian bill before it acts, do you think?
Well, that's not clear. I mean, Paul Goldsmith put out a statement, right on Christmas, just saying, look, they're holding up this other bill. And funnily enough, it was because, it seemed to be because Melissa Lee hadn't done enough work on pushing that bill, because she didn't appear to be that keen on the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill initially. That's why she lost her job. Well, now Paul Goldsmith is waiting. But I think correctly, because I think obviously this idea of a Google tax is probably more sustainable in the long run. So I guess he's just waiting to see what the Australians come up with, and presumably then get policymakers here to work on that and come up with a policy that might fit the New Zealand environment better. And so I wouldn't expect to see anything, to be honest, significant this year maybe, but as you see news companies continuing to contract and lay off workers, the pressure might be more on the government to say, well, is there something you can do, and if you can do it sooner rather than later.
And finally, this week, the Reserve Bank is green-lit to proceed with another chunky cut to the official cash rate next month, despite a halt to the steady decline of headline inflation. BNZ Chief Economist Mike Jones explains. Annual inflation has stayed at 2.2% in the December quarter. With us to explain is BNZ Chief Economist Mike Jones. So, Mike, what drove inflation in this data?
A bunch of components. I mean, I suppose the main factor pushing inflation down over the past year or so has been the tradable side of things. That's why we're back down around the midpoint of the Reserve Bank's target band. But I think the important details of today's numbers were more around, say, the core measures of inflation, the non-tradables measures that have drawn the ire of the Reserve Bank recently. It does look like the inflation pulse in some of those sticky sorts of areas is slowing down, as expected, and that'll please the Reserve Bank.
At long last.
At long last. It's been a long process. It generally is. I mean, once inflation picks up in those sorts of areas, it takes a while to stamp it out, and certainly the Reserve Bank has been frustrated in its efforts variously over the past couple of years. But look, I think the importance of the slowing and easing in labour market pressures has been really key in that regard. And what we saw today was, as I say, non-tradables inflation come down again, very much following the trend we've seen earlier in things like wage inflation as spare capacity in the labour market has opened up again.
Does that cement further rate cuts?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's anything in these numbers to change anyone's views, ours or the Reserve Bank's. I mean, if you kind of step back, you've got inflation largely at target for the last couple of quarters. You've got an economy that's still clearly battling. We've seen that already in the data we've seen this year. And you've got an official cash rate that's still a long way above neutral. So you put all those things together, it says cash rate's still got a ways to fall. I don't think, as I say, there's anything to change the Reserve Bank's guidance. We saw late last year that February will be a potentially 50-point cut, the third 50-point cut in a row to the official cash rate.
So 50 just one more time or twice?
I mean, look, our expectation is one more, because that takes you to sort of 375, and at that stage you're starting to encroach on various estimates of the neutral rate. And I think the closer the bank gets to some of those estimates, and they're in a wide band, the more a sort of softly approach will be justified. So thereafter, our expectation is you see a string of 25-point increases. But there's one thing we know about this year, it's that there is a lot of uncertainty and volatility out there. It's been a rocky start to the year for financial markets, and so the pace and timing of those additional cuts very much still uncertain.
So those risks are overseas driven, or what could happen domestically?
Yeah, a bit of both. I think probably this year more so offshore. I mean, I think we've seen already this year some big changes to, for example, US interest rate expectations, which will impact in this part of the world through things like wholesale interest rates and the New Zealand dollar. We're seeing that already. So look, there's a bit of both, but probably more so offshore, and in particular what we're seeing out of the US. And of course, we've got a new president 2 days in, and we don't know what we're going to get in terms of particularly trade policy as well, which can have an impact on inflation, certainly.
What could those tariffs do to New Zealand?
Well, I think the very high level takeaway and consensus is that tariffs are inflationary. The extent to which and on which countries and how enduring the inflation impulse are all very much up in the air. So I think the playbook that we've seen from central banks, both in the US and here, is kind of play what's right in front of you and don't try and get into sort of scenarios and speculation and all of that. So I think that's going to be the way we're going to play things in the short term is kind of wait and see what we get and assess those policies as they are announced.
But inflation, you thinking, should stay within that middle of the target band?
Yeah, look, I think there's 2 points on that. I mean, the first is our contention is very much still that inflation is under control in New Zealand, and that's very much enshrined in our forecasts of around about 2.5% inflation from here, and in fact getting back towards 2 on the nose by the end of this year. One thing that's caught our eye earlier in the new year is that some of those short-term drivers for inflation have actually nudged up. Things like higher petrol prices. We've got a fall in the New Zealand dollar. And so actually over the next couple of quarters, we're looking at inflation probably closer to 2.5% than the 2 that the Reserve Bank built into its numbers back in November. So still a few short-term niggles to work through. We don't think it is particularly bothersome for the central bank. So overall, inflation under control. But yeah, it's certainly not sort of dead and buried, put it that way.
And thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on nbr.co.nz. See you next week.